What's up, Den of Geek fans? This is Chris Longo here in the den with Seth Porges. Seth, how are you today?
I am so happy to be here.
And tell the people who you are.
Hey guys, I'm a co-director and producer of How to Rob a Bank on Netflix. Prior to that, I made the movie Class Action Park on Max.
Well, first of all, we love Class Action Park. How to Rob a Bank had us completely captivated. So I want to kick off with How to Rob a Bank and understand a little bit about how the story kind of found you. And I know you had about a 4 to 6 year process putting this thing together. Tell me a little bit about how it got developed.
It was a treasure hunt. You know, that's the thing about documentaries. You have this idea about what the story could be, but until you spend sometimes years looking under every nook and cranny, upturning every rock, you don't actually know what's there, right? So I came across this story, 6 years ago now. I was literally just looking into stories about money laundering, thinking there must be something interesting in the world of money laundering, because what do I know about money laundering? What do you know about money laundering?
Not much.
Breaking Bad, right? You know, it's kind of where it begins. There's got to be something cool there. And I found some random write-up on some random subreddit about this group of bank robbers that would launder their money by going to 2 different casinos in either Vegas or Reno, betting half the money on one sports team, the other half on the opposing team at a different casino. No matter who wins, one of those teams is going to win, right? And you're going to get your money back clean. And I thought that was so clever. Who are these guys? Whoever wrote this didn't mention who they were, but that was enough information for me to kind of Google and backtrack into and find out, oh my God, that was the Hollywood Bandit. That was Scott Scurlock and his friends. And that money laundering thing is the least interesting thing about their story.
Sure. And as you start kind of pulling on the threads of this story, like what really stood out to you in terms of Scott's story and who Scott is as a person? Because as you guys kind of unwind this story, he's an enigma. He's a little bit of a recluse in parts of it.
He's a myth. You know, the thing that kept nagging at me the further I went into the story was that every time I'd answer one question, there were 10 more unanswered questions. He was an enigma to the people who knew him the best because he lived this double or even triple life. So people who grew up with him, people who were his best friends, they only knew one side of his personality. So piecing this guy together, the entirety of him was a jigsaw puzzle. It was finding people who knew different aspects about him and combining all that information, perhaps for the first time. But there was something about him and his story that just felt utterly mythological to me, you know, larger than life. Everywhere I looked, I'm like, what is the most insane, narratively satisfying turn of events or character trait that could occur? And the reality of the situation would be 4 times more interesting than I could ever have made up. If I had tried to write this movie as like a scripted crime drama, people would throw it in the trash because it's so cliche and so tripey and so tropey. It's all of these Hollywood cliches everywhere, but it was all real. And that was just something I couldn't shake, because how did this thing that felt like a Michael Mann movie, how could it be so real?
Sure. Where did you start in terms of pulling sources together for this? Like, who were some of the initial people you spoke to, and then how did that kind of snowball from there?
Yeah, so before I reached out to anybody, I just spent as much time as I could reading and researching and finding every little bit of information I could about this story. And it became very clear to me a couple things almost immediately. One was, this may be the greatest American crime story. I mean, we should just like tell people right at the bat a little bit about this story. I mean, this dude, Scott Scurlock, he was the greatest bank robber in American history. He became a bank robber basically after watching the movie Point Break, which is like a personal favorite of mine.
Absolutely.
I'm assuming yours as well. He began to kind of live this romantic outlaw lifestyle, very much like Patrick Swayze's character Bodie in the movie, who, like Scott, would, you know, in the movie, he robbed banks to surf and to live this fantastic male fantasy. Scott kind of did the same thing. He wasn't a surfer, but he did every other outdoor activity, right? And over the course of 4.5 years, he and his friends robbed close to 20 banks in Seattle. And this is 1990 Seattle. So it's like, you got the grunge thing going on. You got like the Microsoft and the tech thing going on, this incredible world around us here. And he becomes this object of obsession by the police and FBI, who create this task force to take him down. And the FBI and the police do not like each other. Kind of that trite trope of Hollywood cinema. And after 4.5 years, it kind of culminates in a way that truly, I don't want to spoil it, but it truly, truly, truly feels like the end of a Michael Mann movie or a Tony Scott movie.
Well, and like you said, like there is that kind of tension between the Seattle Police Department, the FBI, even within the Seattle Police Department. There seems like conflicting stories on how things kind of turned out. And then you have the co-conspirators for Scott, who themselves, I think, as many people kind of reference in the film, aren't the most reliable of sources either.
Oh,
how do you
is.
balance all of that?
Well, we had basically 4 different types of voices in this film. You have Scott himself, who comes to life through his journals and his diaries that we're lucky enough to have. And they show, I think, an incredibly fascinating, incredibly complex, and incredibly tortured person, honestly. And then that's the first kind of voice we have. Then you have Scott's co-conspirators, his friends who were in on it, who knew about this life of crime, right? And then you have his friends and his family who didn't know about it. To them, he was just Scott Scurlock. He wasn't the bank robber nicknamed Hollywood, right? So you have this guy who almost was 2 distinct people, 2 different people. To some people, he was Hollywood. To others, he was Scott. And that was, I mean, from a narrative perspective, just a fascinating thing to explore, this kind of split dual personality he possessed. Then you had the law enforcement, who had no idea who he was, but were obsessed with capturing him. And then you have other people like bank tellers and victims and news anchors, whatever else. But really, we wanted to make a movie where you're not watching this and going, oh, that guy wouldn't talk. You know, sometimes you watch a documentary and it's very clear who sat on the sidelines, right? And we really wanted to make a movie in which we did whatever we could to make sure that every single person who should be in this movie was in this movie.
And in weaving those voices together, I think you guys took a really interesting and unique approach to how you wanted the visuals of the story to unfold, whether that's through animations, through like storyboards, quote unquote, through recreations kind of later in the film, voiceover work that you worked on. Can you tell me a little bit about how you kind of initially conceived it and then how that evolved over the process of actually making the film?
Yeah, I mean, the visual toolkit we end up playing with, as you mentioned, we have archival footage, we have voiceover for Scott's diary, we have animations, and we have live action recreations. Then you just have, you know, interviews, archival, all the normal documentary stuff as well. And how we kind of stitched these all together was truly a group effort, a collaborative effort with our entire team, trying to figure out how do we use all of these things in a way that makes sense logically for what our story is, for the themes of our story, that doesn't just feel arbitrary. You know, if you're jumping around between different visual styles and there's no logic or meaning to it, you're going to be thrown off. And so there really had to be intent behind every shot, every visual, everything we did. And what we kind of stumbled into, and I give a lot of credit to this to one of our producers, a gentleman named Maxim, for kind of figuring out this logic, is that basically everybody in this story felt like they were in a movie when this was going on. This is what they told us. They said, while this was going on, we felt like we were in a movie. This goes for the robbers, and this goes for the cops as well. And so we use that in addition to the fact that he was nicknamed Hollywood by the FBI, in addition to the fact that he was pulling ideas literally from Hollywood movies. And so the animation itself is a storyboard that kind of comes to life. And the idea is this is the storyboard of the movie everybody imagined themselves to be in, right? And as the movie goes on, the storyboard bleeds into real life and it kind of becomes these recreations, which are largely heist scenes. These are largely scenes in banks. And so it's becoming realer and realer and realer as the movie goes on before all you're really left with is reality itself and all of those layers pull back.
And I think with a film like this, like as you said, like everyone imagines themselves in that movie, and you can kind of really go down that path, which you guys do, obviously. But one thing I really appreciated about this film was you guys kind of looked at the other side of it, the bystanders that are around these bank robberies. This isn't a victimless crime here. Could you tell me a little bit about the conversations you had in terms of like shining a light on that aspect of the story, because there were people with a lot of trauma that went through this situation?
Yeah, I kind of view this movie in many ways as a deconstruction of the American myth of the noble outlaw, of the bank robber. Scott Scurlock, the Hollywood Bandit, became a bank robber, perhaps buying into this myth we have of bank robbery itself being a victimless crime, of this Robin Hood persona being an attainable goal, of it being possible to be like Bodie in Point Break and to rob banks but not really have any consequences from robbing banks, both for yourself or for other people. And what we found is, of course, this is not the case. Our understanding of trauma, of course, has changed a lot since the 1990s when this occurred, but every single one of those people who was in a bank who had a gun pointed at them was traumatized. And we also found that this victimhood, that these crimes, the negative effects, the way these crimes sort of rippled through the world go even beyond that. I think the most astonishing thing we found in really getting to know Scott and getting to know his co-conspirators is the effect of living this double life, this life of crime, what it does to you as a person. I mean, Scott entered this world of bank robbery perhaps thinking that this would be a lark, it would be fun, it would be an adventure, not thinking that he would have to cut off close relationships with everybody he loves. that he would have to basically separate the world into buckets, the people who knew and the people who didn't know. And only a very small number of people could he actually open up to. He'd have to stop seeing his family. And so what this movie ultimately became about to me is what it means to live a double life, what it means to live a life of crime, and what that does to you, and how we might think it's Point Break, where it's fun, it's romantic, but it's actually more like Heat, which is kind of where the movie ends, which is the movie largely about what it means to be so obsessed with your work that there's no room for anything else.
Yeah. I want to focus in on Scott's own like journal entries. Were there ones that kind of stood out to you in particular in terms of like this really felt universal in terms of like what he's going through? Obviously, it's an extraordinary situation he found himself in, like particularly with what was going on kind of later in this instance, trying to pull off one last big heist.
Scott's journals allowed us to put his voice into this movie in a way that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. And what really stood out to me in his journals is how tortured he was, how conflicted he was, how clearly he had realized he had gone down the wrong path but felt no way out, felt it was either too late to turn back or he didn't know how to turn back. And he felt resigned to the tragedy of his own existence. In many ways, Scott strikes me as sort of that trope of Greek mythology, the hero who the oracle has prophesized their fate, prophesized their doom perhaps, and they attempt to outrun their fate, but in doing so end up sealing it, right? And Scott is somebody who, it almost like he could see the future. He knew that he was headed down the wrong path. He knew there was no way out from this. But in his attempts to outrun that, he ended up sealing his own fate.
Even in his dreams, I think, at one point, right?
Not just his dreams. I mean, we feature probably 3 people in the film tell us about their dreams. I can't recall the exact number,
dreams,
but we probably filmed 8 or 9 people who told us about their dreams. And it's really amazing to me how spiritual the story became to the participants, to the people involved. And I understand that. It's a story that as it was playing out, the people who didn't know what was happening were searching for answers. The people who did know what was happening were searching for a way out. People began to see it as a myth playing out in real time. And looking back on it now, I can absolutely understand why.
Sure. Anyone that spent time working on a documentary knows it takes an absolute village to get these things across the finish line and produce them in a way that is really
Anyone
high
that
quality.
spent time working on
a documentary knows it takes an absolute
You've been a co-director on
both of those films. Could you tell me a little bit about the advantages
them
in a way that is really high quality? I think you've done that with your another person to kind of lean on. You've been a co-director on both of those films.
Yeah. On both Class Action Park and this, I collaborated with other people. On Class Action Park, my co-director was my friend Chris Charles Scott. In How to Rob a Bank, it was my friend Stephen Robert Morse. And the co-director relationship is a really amazing one when it works out well. I mean, what a good co-director does is saves you from your worst instincts. You know, if you get too much in your head and begin to think like you have all the answers yourself, you're going to go a little bit crazy, right? You're going to put things out there that maybe you understand, but other people don't understand, or don't work for the rest of the world, or don't make sense in whatever context it's in there. And having somebody to work with, to bounce ideas off of, and to pull other ideas from, and to iterate off of each other's ideas, I find incredibly valuable in making something like documentary. And documentaries, the kind of documentaries I make at least, are also to some degree jobs of reporting and of treasure hunting, and having just more people on the team to find people who have the random home movie footage in their attics, to track down sources the world didn't know existed. I mean, we have in our film the key accomplices who the FBI and police knew about at the time of the crimes, as well as accomplices the FBI and police learned about by watching our movie. You know, like we were able to find people and get them to talk who have never spoken about this and admit to crimes. And, you know, that really does take a village.
Now that you have 2 films under your belt, with some like shared common themes throughout, I think both of those films, do you feel like, whatever you're working on next, you want to kind of push in a different direction, or do you feel like, you want to look to some of those similar themes and like developing kind of a style, I guess?
Well, I kind of view both these movies as largely about the same theme. I'm actually curious, in your head, having seen both, do you see any common themes between the 2?
I think like Class Action Park, like there's some extent of true crime. It's got like a tinge of it, but I think like there's a nostalgia factor kind of to both of those things overall, but I'm curious to hear, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I view both these movies as largely about the same central idea. And that, to me, the way I kind of express it is about the tension between the promise and the peril of living a life outside of the rules, right? Class Action Park is about this fantasy wonderland where you can make the decision to care about nobody else and have the best time in your life, and then perhaps there are consequences, and sometimes those consequences can be really horrible. How to Rob a Bank is about somebody who decided that the rules of society didn't apply to him. The norms of society didn't apply to him. He was going to do whatever it took to be free of these things that we just sort of take for granted. Oh, you have to get up and put in a tie and go to work? Not me. I'm going to find another way. But at what cost? And it's sort of, I think, something I'm somewhat obsessed with as a filmmaker, as a journalist, are why we as people sometimes do things that are just patently bad ideas, right? And why we sometimes admire the people who do them. Class Action Park is about an amusement park where I think half the people who watch it are just like, hell yeah, about this place that murdered children, you know? And then How to Rob a Bank, I think a lot of people watching this are like, hell yeah, that guy robbed the banks, even though it was a terrible idea, he left a lot of victims, whatever it is. And I like to make movies that I think analyze this part of us as humans, the part that is drawn to things that on paper make absolutely no sense, but we're still drawn to.
And we push those limits constantly.
We push these limits constantly. About people who did push these limits for better or for worse, perhaps, yeah.
So Class Action Park, you got to debut it at some festivals, 2020, obviously the pandemic, that's when it came out. What's it been like this time around to have it debut on Netflix? Obviously a bigger streamer, more of a global product. What's the reception been like since it's been out there?
I mean, as a filmmaker, especially a documentary filmmaker, there's no bigger, better platform than to be on Netflix. I mean, my goodness, it's crazy to me to think that literally like anybody in the world could just pull up this movie. And, you know, when it came out, I'm like, oh my goodness, we're #2 movie in Norway. We're like the #2 movie in Iceland. People in Sweden like our movie, Australia. It's such a wild and almost like incomprehensible feeling. It's also a true privilege just to have a movie that people have the opportunity to see it. I mean, people forget, but like 10, 15 years ago, documentaries were niche programming. Like you'd have to seek them out at movie theaters. Maybe a Michael Moore movie would end up at a theater, but not many other documentaries. It was nerdy stuff, right? Now documentaries are everywhere, and to be a part of that is such a gift and such a blessing.
So you're one of the biggest filmmakers in Sweden, you're telling me?
I think Scott Skurlock is one of the most popular people in Sweden. Okay. I'll give him the credit, yeah.
Fair enough. What's next for you?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. I'm working on a movie about SantaCon right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's gonna be pretty cool. So stay tuned.
Cool, messy.
All of the above.
A little sloppy.
A little sloppy. All of the above. I cannot wait to share this with you guys. Yeah.
Well, Seth Porges, thank you so much. How to Rob a Bank. It's on Netflix if you haven't streamed it yet. Even if you're in Sweden, if you're in the Nordics,
it's a good time.
It's the biggest show there.
86 minutes, and you know, we really set out to make a documentary that felt like you're watching a 90s action movie, and I think you achieved
it.
Yeah. So if Michael Mann or Catherine Bigelow or Tony Scott made a documentary, is what we were going for.
I guess one quick last question: the Point Break footage, was that difficult to come by?
Ask my lawyers.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? We are the ex-presidents, and as you can see, we are in fact robbing your bank. So with a little cooperation, I won't have to blow your heads off. So I need just a couple...